Alright, guys, today we're going to pick up where we left off on Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and we're going to keep it short and sweet and start talking about the end of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and then moving on to the beginning parts of James Madison's presidency. Should be noted, you guys have an assessment for both last week's notes as well as today's notes, so make sure you're on RenWeb looking out for that. But let's just get started and start talking about American neutrality being challenged. So, Britain and France are going to find themselves at war against each other. Once again, if you remember anything from the Napoleonic videos, that happens quite a bit. And both the British and the French had the US as a major trading partner, meaning we were basically best friends with both of them. Now, have you ever been in that situation when like two of your friends are arguing with each other and they ask you what you think about that situation? Well, that's basically the situation the US is going to find itself in while Thomas Jefferson is president. And naturally, both France and the British are going to get involved with the US. The French and the British both decide to sabotage those trade routes between each other. So, pretty much any goods that were going to France or Britain would be sunk in the middle of the ocean. If a boat was heading to England, then the French would sink that ship. If a boat was heading towards France, then the British would sink that ship, which is not good. But the British took it to a whole step further and started impressing sailors again. Now, Britain desperately needed sailors for its navy for Napoleon and making sure that England was not speaking France anytime soon. So the British pretty much took that Jay Treaty that we talked about before we left on break and literally ripped it apart and reverted back to stealing American sailors. Although it should be noted, they actually even stole British sailors as well, just British citizens who weren't in the Royal Navy that are now part of the Royal Navy. If you're wondering, like, what's the big deal with that and why the British had to resort to something like that, well, if you're looking at it geographically speaking, there's England right there at the top, and there's France at the bottom. There's like 53 miles apart from these guys, known as the English Channel. And that's all Napoleon has to cross in order to invade England. So the only thing keeping Napoleon away from the shores of England was the Navy. So they needed to make sure the Navy was at its A level at all times. Napoleon will never step foot in England, just to put it in perspective. But let's focus more on the US now and talk about what Jefferson does for this. Jefferson decides, you know what? I'm just going to embargo all of your goods. If you guys are going to sink my ships because you guys are fighting, then I'm not doing any trade with you. An embargo is pretty much just a order from the government that forbids foreign trade with like a nation or a specific product or company, in this case a nation. Now, this proves to be incredibly unpopular. I mean, imagine a situation like today. Like, imagine if the US decides to embargo China and you could not get an iPhone anymore. That would be problematic, and most people would be really, really angry because TikTok videos don't make themselves. So, back then, though, this would backfire, as in, like, the US economy is going to tank near the end of Jefferson's presidency. A lot of people just decided, you know what, I'm just going to smuggle it in anyways. I want to get the stuff that I want from France and Britain, so I'll just do it illegally. And that's what smuggling is. Now, Congress isn't dumb. They realize that the Embargo Act was stupid, and they'll repeal it as Jefferson leaves office. There's your notes for Thomas Jefferson, and honestly, that concludes Jefferson's presidency for our perspective. So let's move on to president number 4 at this point, James Madison. So Thomas Jefferson decides not to seek re-election, following Washington's footsteps, and James Madison will win the presidency and become the 4th president of the United States. Madison also was the Secretary of State under Jefferson and was the author of what document again?
Hey, it's the Constitution, Mr. Shoens.
That's right, Constitution. Anywho, so while Madison is president, the Embargo Act will be repealed, but you still have that problem that France and Britain are sinking American ships. So they repeal the Embargo Act because the economy was suffering, but France and Britain are still sinking American ships. So Madison had to come up with a totally different strategy, and it was kind of interesting. He pretty much says, hey, whoever stops sinking our ships, we'll exclusively trade with. So we'll just trade with France if they stop, or we'll just trade with England if they stop. And that doesn't work. Both the British and the French knew that the US was bluffing. They weren't going to forfeit millions of dollars just on a whim. It's kind of like when you're playing poker and someone calls your bluff, and then you're just like, oh man, now what do I do? And that kind of leads to the next escalation of things, specifically dealing with the War of 1812. The tensions between us, the US, and the British are going to get extremely, extremely tense. It's going to be as if we're back in Revolution times. And this is the problem James Madison walks himself into, being that he's the fourth president of the United States. And it didn't help also that you had a new group of people emerging known as the War Hawks. Basically, they're just people who supported war with Britain once again, pretty much going onto the floors of Congress saying, we got this, we'll take them down, round two, we'll beat them, and we'll make sure that no more ships are sunken, and the British respect us, and all this different stuff. And those war hawks in Congress are going to get to the point that Congress declares war on Britain in the year of 1812. And the reason why they decided to do that was because there was honor at stake. So most Americans reading the newspaper and all that different stuff, they were thinking like pride is on the line. Having your own American sailors forcibly join the Royal Navy is a little embarrassing. So a lot of nationalism went to this war, which, if you don't remember, nationalism is pride in your country. There are your notes for James Madison at the beginning. Now, round two. This whole situation we find ourselves in U.S. history, where we won the revolution against the British, and now we're at war with them again. And you might have thought the revolution was exciting, whether it be about Washington and Hamilton and like Paul Revere and like Steuben and all those awesome stuff, but reality, the War of 1812 is not going to be as good as the prequel. The war was a bad timing for the British because they were at war with the French, and it's also going to be a bad time for the U.S. as well. But we'll talk more about that in a second. Going into that war, though, the United States believed that they could win. They were so confident they thought that they could not only win, but we might conquer all of Canada while doing it. And the sole reason why is because Britain was preoccupied. I mean, if we were looking at a world map, do you really think that the British were really concerned of what's going on in North America? They're more concerned on what's circled there. They're concerned about Great Britain. Now, that being said, though, at the beginning of this war, it started to look like that we definitely wouldn't get this, even with the British preoccupied with France. During Jefferson's presidency, he had cut a ton of federal spending in the federal government, basically to make sure that the debt went down and that there'd be a surplus and you can buy stuff like Louisiana. And at that time, America only had 16 warships and 7,000 soldiers ready to go to war with the British. Need I remind you, the British have only lost one war ever in their history, and that was to us during the Revolution, which, spoiler alert, talks about the ending of the War of 1812, obviously. Now, Britain could spare a measly 196 warships for this war when they already have nearly 1,000 plus total ships in their Royal Navy. So, with that being said, the British do what they do best, and they block off all the coasts. They learned a lot from the previous war and wanted to make sure nobody else would get involved. A blockade, in case you don't know, is an action of just shutting down a port or a road or any type of way to move and travel from supplies leaving or going into the area. And that blockade made sure that France would stay out of this business, so Napoleon couldn't even come and help the United States if he wanted to. This time the British could face the US one-on-one, which is something they couldn't do during the Revolutionary War. There are your notes for the end of Jefferson and moving into Madison's presidency, as well as the War of 1812. Now, at this point, guys, that's it for today. Just like in the age-old wisdom of Coach Belichick, no, I'm not a Patriots fan, do your job and do the assessment that is on turnitin.com.